It was no mistake that he was often called the single most effective member of Congress during his time in. So the fact that you know, people can look at him as a lot of things. He's that guest on talk shows. He's that congressman. But we remember him as our congressman because he was in the district a lot. If you go to the Chapac landfill and look it up, I guarantee you, folks, that took forever to clean up. It would still be in the cleanup phase if it wasn't for Barney Frank and the efforts that he brought to bear for us. He has done so much for Norton over the years, and the fact that he would take the time now at this stage of his life when he should be just sitting back and enjoying it to come and join us for an effort to do scholarships says a lot about the kind of man and the kind of person and the kind of congressperson and just public servant that he is. So that's a long way of saying, Barney, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.
And, you know, I talked to Barney, and what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to Barney for a few minutes about things that are going on. And then I know there's probably one or two questions that people might want to ask around to, and Barney's graciously consented to do that. So, first of all, you know, Barney, again, thank you. But as the only Democrat in the country that hasn't announced he's running for president, you know, what's your view on not so much the individual members of the field, but the strategy of having 25 candidates, you know, running for president in this day and age when it seems like what we really need to do is make sure that Donald Trump doesn't get a second term?
You're absolutely right, Bill. Let me say I'm delighted to be here. I did get to Norton a lot because particularly for the first 10 years, beginning in '82, Norton was the absolute center of my district. My district went from the BU Bridge in Boston down to the Braga Bridge, and Norton was right in the middle. Later, they broadened it to include the Bourne Bridge. So I had 3 bridges, but Norton was always a very important focal point for that. I am appalled at the extent to which so many politicians have let their egos screw up our presidential chances. I think it is outrageous. We have these people who have literally nothing better to do, so they decided to run for president. I'm angry at them on 2 counts. First, some of them say, well, you know what? Well, let's do a couple who could be running for other offices. We could have former Governor Huckleberry Hickenlooper of Colorado beating a Republican senator. Beto O'Rourke should be running against John Cornyn. There are some who are in the House, like Swalwell and Moulton, and they all say, well, you know, I can't get anything done here. Well, shame on them. If you are in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, and you work hard and you're thoughtful, you can get things done. And to have the ego where the only thing that's worthy of your talents is to be the president is an arrogance that's damaging. And then to run for president without regard for the negative impact it's having on everybody else. We are clearly hurt by having all these candidates. There'll be fights about who can be in the debate. It's easily caricatured. So I have one proposal to make, and I'm going to make it. I'm about to, I hope, write an article. I urge people who live in the districts or states of some of these candidates to tell them to stop running and stop supporting them. You're going to get emails that say, oh, I need a little bit more money so I qualify for the debate. The answer is, I'm not giving it to you because I think we already have too many people in the debate. And what happens is these are people generally with safe seats, or they're not in office now, and they say, I have nothing to lose. I'm going to run for president. Well, you got to give them something to lose. You got to write to them and let them know, no, I'm angry at you because your selfishness and your ego boost is undercutting the Democrats' chances. And I think at the very least, people say, oh, I have a right to run. The answer is, of course you do. And I have a right to tell you it's stupid that you're running. They are equally constitutionally protected. And I would hope that by September at the latest, people who are still in the 1 or 2% range and have been running for a couple of years, people ought to get angry with them and say, no, I insist that you stop. And this is not a free ride for you, because if you keep doing this, when you are running for something where you may have more of a chance, I won't be there for you.
Barney, President Trump is running on basically a state of your base. I mean, his approval rating came out today at 43%, and he's got like a 90-something% approval rating of Republicans. Is that a strategy that transfers to Democrats? I mean, do you run to the left base? Do you keep trying to be inclusive? I mean, how should Democrats, in your opinion, be responding to the fact that Trump isn't reaching out at all beyond his base, and he's hoping that carries him like it did last time?
I think we need to be taking advantage of that, but part of that requires some discipline on the part of people on our left. Now, I must tell you, I agree substantively with the left on most issues, but the notion that you look for perfection is a terrible idea. I've said before, I've had a feeling that Paul's had, a couple of selectmen. I know it's a very good feeling to go out and vote for a candidate when you're convinced that this is a perfect candidate. Because I once had that experience, most of you haven't. I voted for someone who I knew was going to be perfect. But by the time I ran for re-election, that wasn't true anymore. I mean, I knew, Paul, right, you know, you got to do a couple things. Maybe to get one thing done, you do something else. This notion of perfection will kill us. It gave us Trump in the first place. And the argument, look, we have 330 million people in this country. If we have some discipline here, yes, you reach out to people who are in the middle. For one thing, I would say this to my friends on the left. The differences between the leftward-most candidates, maybe that's Bernie Sanders, and the more mainstream liberal candidates, they may be important in theory, but if you look at America today, you look at the Senate, you look at the distribution of political power, we'll be very lucky if we could get into public policy all of the things on which we have great agreement.
She does that to me, too, so.
Fighting over differences that we're never going to be able to accomplish is a mistake, and I would say this as well. One of the mistakes people make is, well, compromise will damage us. No, you go step by step. You look at Franklin Roosevelt or anybody since then. You have opposition to expanding the government's role in medical care, to protecting the rights of gay and lesbian people, to any of these other activities. The best way to get to where you need to go is to take some very good first steps and show people that the fears were wrong. You show people that, yes, look what happened, we're okay, and then you make it easier to move on to the next step. You diffuse the opposition by refuting it. So yeah, I think the Democrats ought to take, again, we're not talking about the center of mathematically saying what's the middle percentage. We are talking about going after policies where we are likely to have a majority and where we can get them adopted. And remember, these are not the final steps, but they are necessary steps to demonstrate that we can do better. So no, I think we should take advantage of Trump's unwillingness to expand his base and capture the people with whom we don't agree on every issue. And the point I would finally make is this: they're the ones, people maybe who are in the middle, who are going to be helping us rather than vice versa. They're going to put us in the position to do it. But let me say, on medical care, the best thing we can do, if you believe in expanding medical care, do some things that help. Obamacare, remember when it was first passed, it was unpopular because there was this, oh, government medical care is terrible. The experience of Obamacare has increased support for a government role in medical care. And we ought to build on that and take it even further. Not to the final step, but every step leads to the next one.
So true, so true. And right, one of the things that over the last few decades that Republicans have done much better than Democrats is they've learned that control starts at the local level. And they've taken over so many state legislatures, state senates, state houses, and you see that now in the number of abortion bills that are being passed. You see it in a whole host of issues. And to the people in this room who are at the, as you well know, are at the grassroots level, starting, we sometimes tend to look at presidential elections and congressional elections, and we say, yeah, those are the important ones. And yet, as we showed by electing Paul Feeney over a far right-wing opponent who would have done great harm to this district if he'd been elected, those are the things that we do. We don't worry about it so much here in Massachusetts because it's so one-sided in the State House and Senate. But across the country, do you see that as a problem in that so many legislatures are controlled?
Look, we suffer in particular because of the role of state governments in drawing up the House of Representative districts. Yeah, we finally won, but we would have won earlier if it wasn't for this unfairness. Places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Democrats would get 50% of the vote and 20% of the seats, or 30%. And it was bad luck for us. What happened was this: 2010 happened to be a bad year for us. The first 2 years of a president's term are often bad for him, as fortunately it was for Trump. So 2010, for a variety of reasons, was one of the worst Democratic years in recent history. The result of that was that Republicans captured a lot of state legislatures and governorships. And the problem with that was those were the people who were going to do the congressional redistricting. And so that put us in this disadvantage. It's very important in 2020 that we not just do well nationally, but that we hold some of the gains we made at the state level so that the next redistricting will not be nearly as negative to us. But yeah, that's an example. It's not just the policies at the state level, it's the ability to do the congressional districts. And then it's also the policies. Because you have in many of the states a conscious strategy to undermine worker protections and other kinds of things so that you can appeal to industry by arguing that they'll be better off. And there's an example that I give that I wish got more attention, and I write about it, and I'm going to do more. In the year 2016 or 17, or maybe 14 or 15, the UAW tried to organize in a Volkswagen plant in Tennessee. And Volkswagen said fine, because they're a German company that's used to dealing with unions. So they were not opposing the organizing effort. At that point, the Tennessee Republican politicians, led by Senator Bob Corker, who was supposed to be a more reasonable mainstream guy, said to Volkswagen, if you go ahead and have a union, the money you have asked us for expanding the plant, you will not get, because we are determined not to have a union. So they asked Corker, wait a minute, the company doesn't mind having a union. Why are you so upset about a union winning a majority vote? And he said very honestly, you know, if the union gets a foothold, if the union organizes in Volkswagen, wages will go up, which is interesting, because a lot of conservatives used to say, oh, the unions, you don't get anything out of the unions, they just take your dues. But they admitted a union would push wages up. And he said, you know what, if wages go up at Volkswagen, because they have a union, that will push up wages throughout Tennessee. And if wages go up in Tennessee, that will diminish our ability to lure jobs from other states. So the more right-wing control you have of some of these states, the more they will undercut good health, good environment, good tax policy, and good labor policy in our state.
Yep, no question. I'd probably be booed if I didn't ask you the obvious question and the one that's running around on the national basis right now. Does the House impeach, or should the House not impeach?
I think it is not time to impeach. I mean, that doesn't mean never. I remember, some of the audience will, 1973, when the man who was then my congressman, because I lived in Tip O'Neill's district, told the man who became my predecessor, because they moved, Father Robert Drinan, not to impeach. Drinan actually filed an impeachment motion, and O'Neill quashed it. And he said, not yet. This is not the time to do it. More information came out, the tapes and things. And I think that's where we are. Let's go with a couple of things. First of all, we're not talking about removing Donald Trump from office. We're talking about having him impeached by the House and then getting a majority vote of acquittal in the Senate. We wish that weren't the case, but we know it still is. Allowing Trump to say, look, you know, I did so well. Remember, when the House impeached Bill Clinton and the Senate voted even in a majority to convict him, but not 2/3, that was something of a vindication for him. And so I don't understand what you accomplish by trying to impeach him and letting him beat it. Secondly, just in practical terms, the difference between impeaching and convicting him and defeating him for re-election in terms of time in office is less than a year. You know, by the time you got through that, we're into next year. And I think we should focus on defeating him. People say, well, why not impeach? The goal, I believe, that we should be seeking is to change public policy. And I think not letting him get acquitted in the Senate by impeachment lessens our ability to change public policy. The next thing is, I've been disappointed. I think we have better arguments on the merits that we make. He has done nothing to improve the position, the relative position of working people. His tax bill was unfair to them and people see it. He has not done infrastructure. He's tried very hard to weaken health care. He's tried to take away protection of pre-existing conditions. There's very little that he's done. I think we ought to be going after him on this. By the way, the great deal maker, he has completed 0 deals. Not China, not North Korea, now not Mexico, not the Israeli-Arab peace plan, not Iran. The other thing for a great chief executive, one of the things you look for in an executive is appointing good people. Trump's own view is that his primary appointments in the national security, law enforcement, and economic areas were bad. He says his attorney general, the first one he appointed, was terrible. He says the chairman of the Federal Reserve is a disaster. He appointed him. He fired the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. I want to go after him on those things. Impeachment would fuzz it up. And finally, people said, well, what does that mean, you know, in terms of the system? Frankly, I think if he were impeached and convicted at this point, it would leave behind a myth that he had been unfairly betrayed. I want to beat him. I think the health of our democracy and democracy in the world requires beating him, which I think we are on the road to doing. I don't know what Paul thinks about this, but I remember when I was in office, one of the numbers in your polling that you always looked at was what we called your re-elect. How many people, if you were an incumbent, would vote to re-elect you? And when that re-elect number got below 50, you were worried. He's in the 30s. So I think we are better off. If he could be impeached and convicted, that'd be a different story. And maybe more will come out, although it's very hard. By the way, I will tell you, I do not see where they find in the Constitution the view that a president cannot be indicted. I think that is wrong. I was glad to see Elizabeth Warren say what I said on television last night. Every Democratic candidate for president should announce that if elected, he or she will reverse that and will instruct the Justice Department to reverse this view that a president can't be indicted. There's no evidence for it. There's no reason why that should be there, and that should go forward. But I do think from the standpoint of getting what we want, at this point, continuing the fight politically is better. And again, the issue is not do we impeach Donald Trump and get him out of office, but does the House impeach him and let him get a majority of acquittal on the Republican side, or are we better off continuing to fight him on the electoral front, keeping in reserve, as Tip O'Neill did, an impeachment if we finally get some things that even the Republicans will have to vote for. And I want to add on that, by the way, and obviously I agree on this with Nancy Pelosi. I am very pleased because it is now clear that she is one of the great leaders in American political history. And some of the people who are after her, they ought to be willing to admit that she has done an excellent job of countering Donald Trump. And, you know, being Speaker turns out to be very hard. Being in charge of other legislators can be difficult. Nancy Pelosi is the first person who will leave the speakership with a reputation that was better than before, since Tip O'Neill. Every speaker since Tip O'Neill has gone out of office diminished. And I think Nancy has shown a great deal of skill in this regard.
Barney, last point, last question before I open it up to people to ask you questions is, when you were in office and you went through the Clinton impeachment and all kinds of things like that, and people back then used to talk about how divided we are, how are we going to come together, how is this going to work, we're so divided. And yet, now that looks like a kumbaya moment compared to where we are right now. So, the natural tendency is when one side is just totally ignoring anything that doesn't fit their goal. If you do the same thing, you just make the polar opposites. And if you don't do the same thing, then they beat the crap out of you with it. So, people at our level, what should we do? What can we start to do to try to make it better?
Absolutely right. The Republicans have had an advantage. Well, first of all, let's be clear. It was not as bad. And people say, when did this absolute vicious partisanship start? And there's a clear day, and let's be very firm about that. January 21st, 2009, when Barack Obama became president. Even when Clinton was being impeached, legislation was going forward. Under George W. Bush, when the Democrats took over in his last 2 years as a majority, we worked with him on the financial crisis. In September of 2008, a month before the presidential election, we gave him more support than the Republicans. We knew it was unpopular, but it had to be done. There was good cooperation until 2009. Obama became president, and one of the worst negative forces in American political history, Mitch McConnell, who just disgracefully smiled when he said, "Oh yeah, we'll reverse our position and we'll confirm a candidate next year," which we wouldn't have done, which we didn't do under Obama. He announced that defeating Obama was their #1 priority. And by the way, for a while they have this advantage. I'm not generally a Bible quoter, but there's one biblical story that I think has political relevance. It's the story of King Solomon, in which, trying to decide between two claimants to be the mother, he said, "Okay, I'll cut the baby in half." And the real mother then said, "Okay, I give up," because she didn't want the baby cut in half. Well, all right, here's the deal. In this situation, the electorate is King Solomon. Government is the baby. The Democrats are the real mother and the Republicans are the fake mother. So when there is a deadlock and the choice is, okay, we're going to cut the baby in half, the Democrats say we give up. Because we believe in government. We understand there's dysfunction. So they've had that advantage. And we had to fight back on the same terms. So the answer is yes. Be as tough on them as they have been on us. But be clear why. We are tough on them because of their irresponsibility. We don't say cooperation is a bad idea. We denounce their failure to cooperate. And it's important because the only way we're going to get out of this is when Republican voters start, or voters in general, start punishing the Republicans for that. Now, it happened in 2018, and that's our hope for 2020. And that's why, to go back to your question, I do think we ought to take advantage of his focus on the narrow base and be a little broader. Because the only way, at this point, virtually every Republican in Congress is more worried about being defeated in a primary by a right-winger than losing in November. 2018 began to change that. It will change because they're not there ideologically, most of them. They're there out of political survival. The day the electorate starts punishing right-wing Republicans for being too far to the right and being too Trump obedient is the day that this will break. So winning for us in 2020 is not just important for public policy, it's a way to break this. If you penalize the Republicans for this vicious partisanship, then you will, because Democrats have, here's the deal. You look at the last few years, Republican presidents have gotten much more support from Democratic Congresses for important public policies than Democratic presidents have gotten from Republican Congresses. Because if you're in a legislative body, there are two incentives to cooperate with the chief executive. One is that you're of the same party and you want your party to look good. The other is that you want government to succeed because you believe in it and you believe it's important for the voters for that to happen. When a Republican president faces a Democratic Congress, Both of those operate to push for cooperation. When a Democratic president has a Democratic Congress, you have both. You have the agreement to do the right thing to help your president, and you have the agreement to do the right thing because you believe in it. When there is a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, you don't have the partisan motive, but you have the we believe in government and we have to do the right thing motive. When a Democratic president faces a Republican Congress, neither one of those incentives to be constructive works. They don't want to help the Democratic president, and they want to trash government. They don't like it if government succeeds. By the way, that's why they are in such a fury over the Financial Protection Consumer Bureau, because their mantra from Ronald Reagan on has been, government is the problem, not the solution. Then you look at the Consumer Bureau. The whole function of the Consumer Bureau is to protect citizens from abusive private companies. Doesn't mean rejecting capitalism. It means recognizing that there will be some abuses. And the notion that you need a government agency to protect citizens against private sector, that's holy water to the devil. They hate that. And so that's where we are in this situation. That's why the only solution there is Republicans at this point, as I said, have no incentive to help a Democratic president. The only way to give them an incentive is if the voters begin to punish them for the obstruction.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Is there anybody that would like to ask the Congressman a question? Okay, we'll start with the lady right here.
Hi, I'm Christine Mans from Franklin. I've heard a lot of people, even in our town, and there, when we were out holding signs for our state rep Jeff Roy, people saying, well, we're not voting for you, Democrats, because you're for open borders. So I don't know how to get that message out to people that, no, we just want to be fair. And I think that's going to come up with the GOP's plan. Oh, the Democrats are for open borders. And I think that's got to be addressed in a more positive way.
I agree. I think we haven't been clear enough about what we want to do, and it's we can't allow hypersensitivity to veto good ideas. The fact is most Democrats are not for open borders, are supportive of things, but there is this problem that Democrats have been kind of inhibited from saying so because they will be associated with Trump. I think they should be encouraged to say, no, we do want to obviously control our borders. Here's how we want to do it. So I do think we need to articulate that better. Because that, even still, I have to say, as a political strategy, it didn't work that well for them. In 2018, he ran on the immigration restriction, and he lost out on health care and other things. But we should still try to improve that by more clearly articulating, yeah, here's what we're for, that are for closing the border. There's no question. We can't just let anybody come who wants to come, as nice as that would be. And Democrats believe that there should be restrictions, but have been inhibited from saying so. And I think sometimes you have to say so.
Mike.
I'm Michael Toole Norton. I'm curious what your thoughts are. The regulations that bear your name have basically disappeared, and we see things like school loans being one of maybe the next big bubbles of a generation that can't afford that, which are $1.4 trillion, bigger than what the banks had the last time. What's your thoughts on the
Well, actually, the regulations have survived better than we had hoped. They've killed the Consumer Bureau, which is part of where the student loan thing is, but they weren't able to repeal it. It's still there. If a Democrat wins, the legislation is still in place. In other areas, the only major change has been, which is one that I think was reasonable, they went a little too far, which was to relieve the smaller banks from the restrictions. Although, by the way, when you look at, if you talk to community bankers, there may be some here, one of the major sources of complaint for them about regulation has nothing to do with what Chris and I did about abusive practices. It has to do with smuggling and money laundering. That's the area where they have cracked down. In general, the abuses of last time, the home mortgages, that's been kind of cleared up. Student loans were a problem. They're not as big a problem because they're just not as large and they don't affect as much of people's area. Yes, it's been, well, put it this way, on student loans, there was a problem. It's not a current one. We're talking about an overhang from before. One of the things the Democrats did succeed in doing was putting more of that in the government and less of that from the private sector. So at this point, I think we're in reasonably good shape about that. The student loan issue is at this point more of an individual problem, which doesn't make it not a problem. But I don't think it's a systemic problem. I don't think, well, part of it, by the way, is that, look, you already have a bailout built in there because a lot of these loans were guaranteed by the government. So as these loans default, it's not going to go on the banks. It's going to go on the federal government. That's why some of them have said, look, let's recognize this and write them down now. But it's not going to cause the kind of bank failures that we had before.
Anybody else have a, yes, sir.
Congressman, one of the things that's not being talked about enough, I think, is Russian interference in U.S. elections. It's obviously the president is not going to do very much about it. What can be done? Congress do anything to make sure it's only in 2020 election?
Well, one, in states where the Democrats are in control, they can provide some protections for the electoral system. There are two kinds of interference. The most serious are where there is actual interference with the electoral process. And I think that one, the FBI, we can control that. The other one, and this is frustrating, it's interference that comes from falsity through the internet. Now, you just wish people wouldn't be so gullible and stupid. I think that's gotten a little bit better because there's some awareness of this. But I think mostly what we have to do here to go further is on that area, not the physical interference with the electoral process, but the kind of propaganda aspects. Monitor the internet very closely. And when misinformation is put out, counter it right away. There has to be, you know, when in some area they put out the wrong date for the election, put out the right date right away and say this is what happened. I think there has to be more of a immediate response in those areas. Behind you.
Oh, okay. Yes. Jen.
You may have touched on it just a little bit already, but as far as the media goes, they gave a lot of free press to Trump in 2016. What can they do to combat?
They've gotten better at that. For one thing, media in general now, many of them will refute. They'll run what the person said, but show how it was wrong. And I think they will not be quite as uncritical as presenting him as kind of a spectacle without some kind of criticality to it. I think they've all gotten better at saying, here's what he said, but here's the truth, the fact-checking, and others. So the media has improved in that regard. My problem with the media is, and it includes some of the media on the left, as I said before, one of the problems we have is a lot of people have been persuaded that government is a bad thing. And since we're more the party of government than they are, that can benefit them. And the problem with the media is that they tend to reinforce that. Even the media on the left or the TV, you get the local TV and they have all the scandals and all the things. Nobody reports what government does well. And that undermines the notion of government. And that included, I thought, Stephen Colbert, when he was on the other show, was awful. Because whenever you turned that on, government was awful. Jon Stewart, the same. Yeah, what he said in any case was accurate. But no government official ever appeared who wasn't a buffoon or a crook or something like that. And I just wish we could get media to talk more positively. We can't obviously control that. But I do think with regard to Trump, they understand that now. And they're more likely to show. Well, here's the other thing. They've got the material. When he said things in 2016, you had no way to refute him. Now he'll say something today, and they can run the clip of when he said the exact opposite. And they're doing better at that. I think that's the problem for him in general, is that everything he promised in 2016 sounded good because he started with a blank slate. I think holding him accountable in his own words, you'll see more of that.
Somebody on this side? Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, you authored or co-authored the Dodd-Frank bill. When I read about it recently, it had started to spin, even though I minored in economics. But it's been 10 years. What would you change in that bill that regulates banks?
Not a lot. Here's what I would do. I had to compromise a little bit. The single greatest problem that we had to deal with was that the financial community had come up with ways to take risks for which they were not responsible. They could make loans, but somebody else would be stuck if they didn't pay off. And one of the ways we dealt with that was what we called risk retention. The notion is that if you make a loan and then sell the right to collect on that loan, you have to pay a percentage of the loss if the loan isn't paid off. And we weren't able to get that as completely as I like. A lot of it is in there, but I would have basically applied that to any loan whatsoever, so that you restore market discipline. It's one thing when you're making a loan, if you're going to be penalized if they don't pay back. If you have no interest in whether or not they pay back, you're going to make some loans that shouldn't be made. You make money on the quantity of the loans, not the quality. Another small one that I would have changed, we in our bill in the House outlawed the right of a financial institution, a bank, a brokerage, whatever, to require that a customer go to arbitration if he or she had been cheated. And say that they could go to arbitration if they wanted to, but they had the right to go to court, because the arbitrations overwhelmingly favor the institution. And that was only made optional. It wasn't made, that is, optional. The Securities and Exchange Commission was given the right to ban arbitration, and they haven't done it. But as I said, the main one would have been to apply that principle on the loans to everybody.
Okay, a couple more before we let Barney off. Yes, the lady over there.
As a cast of thousands of Democrats who are running to be nominated, who do you think has the best chance?
It's early to tell. Look, obviously, Joe Biden is doing well, and people are saying, well, in the past, the front runner didn't always win. That's true. The thing about Biden is then nobody's going to find out anything about him that's going to cause a problem. And I would say I'm encouraged by this. I think there was an overreaction on the question of his being too touchy-feely. I mean, I must say I have my own evidence that this was not sexual on his part, because I was present once when he kissed a politician's spouse. And I don't think he had a sexual interest in my husband. He had his arm around both of us. He leaned over. He's very tall. He kissed Jim on the forehead. So I'm glad to see people beyond that degree of hypersensitivity. There was a time when, the Democrats shouldn't nominate a white man. Well, the Democrats haven't nominated a white man since 2004. Yeah, there's prejudice in the society, and we should be fighting it. But to accept the view that we should never again nominate a white man is a very bad idea. And in fact, if you look at it, 70+% of the Democratic primary voters now support a white man. That's good, that not that white men should have it, but that block isn't there. Other than that, it remains to be seen who emerges. Now, I think you can see there's a kind of, it's kind of like the March Madness. There are brackets. There's the African-American bracket in which Kamala Harris appears to be beating Cory Booker. There's the left bracket of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. She's gaining on him. There's the kind of novelty bracket of Beto O'Rourke and Pete Buttigieg, in which Buttigieg is coming ahead. I mean, ironically, I never thought I'd live to see this day, but I think Buttigieg does better than O'Rourke partly because he's gay. I mean, because he's a novelty and then gets attention, and because he's talented, uses it well. So at this point, I read what it is. I think Biden's in the best shape. It's not for sure. I can't see something that's going to unveil him. I disregard the view that we should not nominate a white man, but I don't think we should have a ticket of two white men. So I think you're going to have a ticket that's going to include either a woman or or an African American, or Kamala Harris as both. But beyond that, I'm ready to wait and see who I think can win. And I'll say this. Yeah, you like to have, as I said, a perfect candidate. But the differences among every Democratic candidate for president are small compared to the differences between any of them and Donald Trump. I mean, that's what people have to keep in mind. And given that beating Donald Trump is a factor, someone said to me the other day, someone on the left, oh, you're too pragmatic, you're worrying about electability. I said, we're talking about an election. We're talking about making public policy, and you have to win the election to do that. Complaining that I'm taking electability into account and picking a candidate is like complaining that I'm taking taste into account when I'm deciding what to eat. I mean, it's essential to the process, and I hope people will keep that in mind.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill. Bill, somebody mentioned that Bill was very generous and said we had to get off to other events, and I don't know about the senator, but I have to go home and take a nap. So that's my other event, but I have enjoyed this.
All right, thank you very much. I just want, before I turn it back over to Barbara, I just want to say we have been so lucky in this district. Barney's district, which didn't always include us, have been lucky. You had Father Drinan. We had Barney Frank. We now have Joe Kennedy.
He's doing very well. He's very well respected.
Yes, absolutely. And these are people. But I will tell you that whenever I think back, and regardless of who holds this seat for long, Barney Frank will always be my congressman. And